All right, my friends, we are back. We're going to talk room acoustic, target curves. We've got Anthony Grimani in the house. That's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. Hey, folks, I'm Gene Delasella with Audioholics. We got my fellow paisan back, Anthony Grimani. How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. And yourself?
I'm doing okay. I'm a little tired. Been shooting videos all day, but you know what? We planned this live stream. It's been way too long since you've been on the channel. And I think it's time we get you back on. We're going to do a series of these. We want to do a series of these to talk about target curves, room curves, acoustics, and how that all interplays together. And I think it's time to refresh and go over all these important topics.
Cool. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Excellent. Cool. So where should we start?
You have a slide presentation. You want to talk a little bit about that and acoustics and all that good stuff?
Well, yeah. So what, it's funny, there's just like so many topics, there's a whole bunch of different angles that you can get into the conversation with. And the conversation is ultimately today is about acoustics, but that particular thing that's called target curves, which is the I guess the target of what you're trying to go for when you're calibrating a system. And when you're calibrating a system, presumably it's after you've done something to the acoustics of the room, something to the speaker choices and speaker positions in the room. Now you're tuning it with some kind of EQ. And what are you tuning it to? And there's a lot of discussion out there in the forums. There's a lot of discussion actually in technical committees. I'm on some of them, these international committees where everybody's like pushing and pulling, going, no, the target curve should be this and should be that. And what is that? So I thought we would talk about that and review what affects a target curve, what does the speaker do to the room, what does the room itself do, and how altogether that leads to a response as measured by microphones that happens to sound good. Ultimately, we're trying to make it sound good. So that's what we're going to talk about today is target curves.
Very cool.
All about target curves. So hey guys, I had the good fortune of visiting Gene at his place a little while ago and had a good time with him over in Florida. And we had a conversation. We spent a bunch of time geeking out over tuning his system, and we had a conversation about target curves. And I don't know, I broached the topic of like, hey, when you take a decent speaker and you measure it 2 to 3 feet away from the speaker in the what's called the near field, which is where your measurement or your listening, if you're really close, is dominated by the direct sound from the speaker to you. There's always reflections in the room, but if you get closer enough to the speaker, you're in the near field. And a decent speaker, when you're just 2 to 3 feet away, 24 inches, 60 centimeters to 100 centimeters away from the speaker, is going to look like, if it's a good speaker, it's going to look like it's a flat response. Now, the term flat sounds bad generally, right? Gene, you say, oh, this thing is flat. That's like a flat tire or a guitar that's tuned flat. It doesn't sound good. Well, in audio, when you look at what's called frequency response, which is frequency on this axis and either voltage or sound pressure level on the other axis, when you're putting in a test signal that's equal level into the system at varying frequency, you want to get back the same thing, equal output at all frequency. And when the result is a flat line, that's called a flat response. In medicine, flat line, not good. In audio, flat line, good. So you put a microphone 2-3 feet away from the speaker. It's a good speaker. You feed it either a sine sweep or pseudo random pink noise or pink noise from your test system. You measure it and you go, wow, that's nice and flat. And then you pull the microphone back to your main listening position, and it ain't flat no more. It could look like this. And what is that? Is that right? Is that wrong? What is that? Is there something you got to correct in that? Well, the thing that changes between being right up close to the speaker and far away from the speaker isn't so much the distance change from here to here in the direct path, but is the fact that as you get further into the room, there's more reflections in the balance between reflected and direct sound. There is a higher ratio of reflections. In fact, at the typical MLP in most listening rooms, even if they're treated, you've got more reflected energy than direct sound. And that reflected energy puts its thumbprint on the sound waves that left the speaker. And that thumbprint is something that to an extent wants to be corrected and to an extent doesn't. And this is where you got to understand what the target curve should be. So I call that the room thumbprint. So there's things that the room does to your speakers in how the two work together that completely messes it up. And there's things that change the measured response, but don't actually change what you're hearing of it. And this is where it gets complicated. So I talk about room thumbprint. I think of a concert hall, big room, lots of instruments playing. There's a thumbprint in here. You're sitting in this room. It sounds nice and open, and there is a tonal balance to the thumbprint of the room. There's also a reverberant field, a sense of spaciousness. And those of you who like classical music would like to be able to put this into a small room, play the same concert hall, and hope that the thumbprint of the room doesn't mess it up too much. Now you're sitting in the room, you're hearing the direct sound, you're hearing the reflected energy, you're hearing a change of tonal balance of what the room's introducing it. And that overall interface of the speaker and its overall radiation is called a sound power, together with how the sound in the room is decaying with time at different frequencies, is the thumbprint of the room. And all of that needs to be controlled if you want decent sound. So I think of all of that as acoustics. Some of it is speakers, but the acoustic output of the speaker and how it bounces in the room and reflects over time and what gets into your ear canal is an acoustic event. And I like to talk about it because it really affects sound quality way more than cables, power cables, esoteric amps, and a bunch of other stuff. And I know a lot of people already now are going, "Ooh, that's not true." It's like, well, listening tests I've done over the 40 years of messing around with this show that treat the room acoustics, tune out its problems, then start working on the other more esoteric things in terms of how you're spending your money. So I think paying attention to the acoustics is at least 50% of the sound quality. It's fixable, and it costs a lot less money than swapping out the current power amp you have for a $25,000 power amp. Just put a few $1,000s into tuning the acoustics, and you'd be amazed what you get with that. So,
yep.
So let's talk about speakers, Gene.
Sure.
You want to talk about speakers? You have some speakers.
We like speakers.
You like
got them in every room.
You got speakers everywhere. You got big speakers, small speakers. So, I know you and I have already talked about this on one of these live streams. I know you talk about it. There's this thing in the character of a speaker called the sound power. Mm-hmm. And it's not quite what it seems. Sound power is not how powerful is the sound. It's actually a mathematical term that defines, in a sense, a view of all the different radiation points all the way around the speaker that go into the room, and which over time lead to energy. If those of you who remember a little bit of physics from high school, power is one thing. Over time, you have actual energy, kilowatt hours. A kilowatt doesn't do anything until you put some time on it. So it is known that if you want good sound, you really want to have good sound power in the speaker so that it radiates evenly to all of the seats. And the work, I guess I always bring him up, Dr. Floyd Toole spent his life proving that that's important. Now to get there, you want a smooth frequency response. So the sound that's going from the speaker to your head needs to be even, like its rendering of the sounds at all frequencies needs to match what's put into the input terminals, whether it's a passive or an active speaker. But also the sounds that are going away from you and bouncing around the room need to be smooth. And they need to be smooth because they're going to bounce around the room and eventually get to you. So if you make a speaker in which there's really good direct sound, but the sound that's going off at 40 degrees is a rough frequency response, eventually that's going to get back to you and tweak the overall thumbprint of that speaker. So a good speaker may as well have low distortion, and there's a lot of argument about how you define distortion. It may as well play as loud as you want it to play without messing up. So I have this little diagram that I think I've shown a few times on these live streams about the reflections in room. So let's take a really good speaker, put it as your center channel in your home cinema, or it could be a left channel in a 2-channel system. There is a direct sound that I'll show here in blue. Largely, the room is not affecting that sound. Those waves are leaving the speaker and they're getting to your ears basically unaffected. Assuming most of you guys listening to this are in rooms that are less than 300 feet long, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then there's the sounds that bounce off the wall. This is the first reflection point off the right wall. That's, more or less at about 45 degrees in my diagram. And then there's all of the other reflections. Here I'm just showing up to 3 points of reflection. There's a whole bunch of red arrows that represent the paths of reflection after either 1 bounce, 2 bounce, or 3 bounces. They're all quieter than the blue sound. They're not as loud. They're all delayed. But all together, that sum total of all these red arrows, which I think I've counted them once, is something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in one direction, 7 in the other direction. So there's 14 of those for every direct sound. And this is only the side walls and only 3 reflections at individual points. So it's not even what's there. But those 14 mean that the reflections dominate. So you are generally listening to more reflected energy, more sound that's bounced around the wall and got into your ear canal than what's coming directly from the speaker. So that room thumbprint has an enormous effect on what you're hearing. And so the quality of that reflected sound matters a lot. You really want to take control of it. You don't want to kill it. You want to keep it in there, but it does really matter. So in the case of the speaker line, this is a slide off the Grimani Systems slide deck, but in the case of the speakers we make, we developed a special waveguide called the conic section array. No, not comic section, conic section. Conic section array, which is a special waveguide that takes the sound of the speaker and splays it out really evenly at all frequencies in all directions, horizontally and also vertically with some focus, but horizontally very wide. And it just means that those red arrows have the same character as the direct sound. So this would be a different way to look at this. So this would be a speaker that I would say is not so well designed. So instead of arrows, I'm actually showing you a bubble of sound. It's not really what sound does, but just a bubble that represents the equal energy around the speaker. Most speakers at the low frequencies are going to have a nice, big, wide open hemispherical bubble. And there's a lot of speakers that at the mid frequency, they start to narrow down. And that narrowing means that some of the energy going to the wall, let's say at 1.5 or 2 kilohertz, is reduced by 6 or 7 or 8 dB. And then a lot of speakers at the higher frequencies in this blue arrow are quite narrow, where they're only about an angle of plus and minus 20 dB within which they're equal. So you go off from that point because you're sitting on the right of the couch. You don't have a lot of highs, but also what's bouncing off the walls is quite attenuated compared to the bass. That's known today by a lot of research to not be the best way to design a speaker. The dispersion is inconsistent, the sound is uneven in the room, and the sound of that speaker is going to vary a lot from room to room. So you listen to it in this one room, it's going to have a character. You move it to another room, it's going to have a different character. Or if you have the same speaker in a whole house system that's in multiple rooms, as you walk around, it all sounds different.
It makes it less predictable. It makes it less predictable on how to treat the room acoustically when the speaker is inconsistent like that.
It's less predictable in terms of its sound quality. It's less predictable in the target curve. So when you put up a microphone and you go to equalize it either manually or automatically, you don't really know what you should be targeting. This is not great. This instead is good. So here's a speaker with a good the same low frequency radiation as the original one, but in which effort was put so that the mid frequency radiation is the same bubble and the high frequency radiation is the same bubble. And there's a bunch of people who are obsessing over this. We are one of those in Grimani Systems. We obsess over this. And to be fair, there's other people that obsess over that. You happen to have a set of speakers from a company that obsesses about that. I'm going to put up a diagram, and then I'd love it to you showed me a diagram a few seconds ago that was really cool. So this dispersion is consistent. The room-to-room consistency is better, and it's more predictable. So that's sound power. The term sound power meaning that the net radiation at all frequencies is even, and the sound power is smooth. More power to you. To do this is kind of difficult. To get speakers to have a really even dispersion usually takes a 3-way speaker with really well-designed crossovers, the right kind of drivers, all of the right crossover character, and it costs money. You get what you pay for if it's well-designed. So you need wide dispersion drivers. We find that by using active DSP amplifiers where you can control the crossovers much better than with passive components, you get there better. And with some speakers today, you can have active speakers that have built-in room correction that do it all like right there. That's a better way to go. The speakers we make are done that way. So here's an example of one of our small speakers, the Rixos S 2-way speaker. Waveguide over here is really good at dispersion. The crossover is lower than normal, and the net bubble of sound that goes into the room is very consistent with frequency. You have better sound power. Another speaker we make that is done that way. So let's skip forward to how do you know if you've picked a speaker with a good sound power? So there's this thing called the spinorama. Dr. Floyd Toole gave it that name because the way you measure it, you put the speaker on a rotator and you spin it slowly around the microphone in 10-degree increments. You measure, move 10 degrees, measure, and you get all these measurements around this way and that way. You turn the speaker on its side and you get 70 response measurements. And then from that, you can produce some charts. So here's an example of one of the speakers we make. And that chart is now standardized in the industry. It's an Audio Engineering Society standard, and I'm working to make it a CTA and CEDIA standard. But in that, with the speakers from the company you mentioned, Gene, can I mention names?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Perlison is, there you go. Perlison is a company that is I hate to call it a competitor. I call it a colleague. You know, we're in the same kind of thought process on how to make a good speaker. There's a bunch of ways that they've done that. The way the tweeters arrayed, the way they do the crossover, the way they do what they do is right and yields you in their spec sheets. You'll actually see curves that look like this thing, the spinorama curve. So what this says, this is a standard. In black is the direct sound, the sound from the speaker on the listening axis, whatever is defined by the manufacturer, direct sound to your seat position. In green is the listening window, which is an average from 30 degrees this way to 30 degrees that way and plus and minus 20, basically the sound that's going to the seat positions. And then in yellow is the energy going to the wall, ceiling, and floor. And in blue is the net average going in all directions, the sound power. And you'll see in the speaker that the direct sound and the window are very similar. The energy that's going towards the walls is a decent replica of that with a 3 to 4 dB attenuation here. And the sound power looks like it's the same shape as the direct sound, just turned down about 5 or 6 dB with a little nick of about 3 dB in the mid-range. That when you look at a speaker response from a manufacturer and they did this right at a proper lab, that tells you this is a speaker that's going to sound good. And I know it's a little arrogant to go, hey, you can just look at the curves and go, it's going to sound good. But again, Floyd Toole has spent his life proving that if you make a speaker that looks good on these curves, I forget the number, 78% of people are going to say, that sounds good. Mm-hmm. Maybe you're not in those 78%, but maybe you are. So there's another speaker we make. There's a speaker by a different manufacturer that will go unnamed, but it shows the axial response and the sound power. And you'll see the sound power has a little nick in it over here. Here's another speaker from a different manufacturer that shows that as you go off axis, these are individual curves, things start to look pretty ugly. Here's another speaker where you see the spinoramas with the on-axis response, the listening window, the early reflections, and the sound power. And you can see the sound power here is different to the direct sound in a few different ways. One is it tilts down. It's got this slightly extra nick, and then at the higher frequencies, it falls off. And you can see it in the inverse of the sound power, which is the directivity index. So when you look at this is the first clue of what the in-room response is going to be like, and the first clue of what your target curve should be expecting. So if you see an expected in-room response that looks like this, you may want to specify a target curve that either lets that be or compensates for it.
So you're talking about getting rid of that BBC dip, the 2 kilohertz BBC dip?
Well, it's not because of the BBC that's there, but that's a commonly known thing. So here's where it gets interesting. It is accepted in the psychoacoustics literature, as in people who have studied the perception of sound, that below 1 kilohertz, you're hearing the sound power of the room. The nets, the speaker, its radiation, and what the room is reflecting back to you. So what you're going to measure is what you hear. It's accepted that between 1 and about 3 kilohertz, it's blending. It's slowly changing. And above 3 kilohertz, 1, 2, 3, you're hearing your perception of the spectrum. Even if the microphone's measuring errors, your perception is what the direct sound is going to measure. So this is kind of interesting. On this speaker, you may want to establish a target curve that goes against that, but not completely. So if I was told, okay, I have this speaker, I would say your target curve should probably have a little bit of a rise and then flatten back down over here. And then because the axial response is relatively smooth, you may want to let it fall off. If you try to compensate that, it's going to sound too bright. I'll continue. So, Gene, you just showed me just before we got started, you showed me a chart of your per listens after you tuned them and spent some time obsessing over them.
Yep,
so
that's them.
That's with
the subs.
With the subs. This is Gene's final, I guess we'll call it his resulting target curve. This is what Gene measured, and he listened, and he measured, and he listened, and he tweaked things until he went, I love the way this sounds. And then he measured and got this.
Yeah, this is at the listening position, but it's consistent across all 4 seats in the listening area. I don't just measure one spot.
So this is a solo microphone, single mic. So there's a lot of wiggle. Ignore that. If you average this over a bunch of seats in the room, it'll be a lot smoother. But what you'll see here is there's a little bit of rise at low frequency, which is normal. And I'll explain that later, that you would want that rise. It's not that the speakers are playing louder. It's just that the way the microphone is picking it up is getting more energy down there. If you were to bring that back down to where it was on a straight line compared to the mid-range, it would sound thin.
Very thin.
I'll get back to that. But generally speaking, you've got a response that's going all the way straight up with a very slight tilt, all the way straight up to 10 kilohertz, and then is just angling down, which is what I expect out of those speakers, because they also have a really flat sound power. Right? Not as flat as the stuff we do with the waveguide, but pretty close. So I'm getting there. So one thing that affects the target curve and what you're hearing is how the speakers are radiating sound into the room, the sound power, the off-axis response. And then those sound waves are bouncing from the room surfaces, the walls, the ceiling and floor, and coming back to you at some point, either directly from behind, the side, the top, the bottom. And they're all adding up some sauce into the room. So let's talk about that, which is part 2. Let's talk about rooms. If you can switch over to my slide deck.
Yep, hold on a second.
Let's talk about rooms. So I think of the room acoustic about the interface ultimately between the speaker, the room, and the listener. How, what is that room doing to connect all those sound waves back over to your ear? So interesting factoid I already mentioned is that at the main seat of a room, whether it's tuned or treated or untreated correctly, there's more reflected sound than direct. There's just a lot more reflected waves, and we need to take control of that. Does not mean kill it. It just means taking control of it so it's not random. So this is a room with no treatments, direct sound. There's reflections. This is more of the same. I actually want to point out that in a room with no treatments at all, about 75% of the sound you're hearing is reflected from the room, and there's chaos. So we need to do something to control that. That something is some amount of absorbers, some amount of scattering devices, also known as diffusers. We're going to place them around the room. We'll talk about that in another session. We'll put them in various places in the room so that in the end, you hear a clear direct sound and then some reflections around the room that have an even tonal balance. So what the room is returning to you has the same energy in the bass from your direction, the bass, the mids, and the highs, and that the resulting immersion is really smooth. So that's where we want to try to go with the room. So that decay time is the result of multiple reflections, and we want that decay, all of those reflections as they bounce around and decay down, we want that to be just the right time and the right spectrum. Spectrum being, like I said, the same amount of bass, mids, and highs in those reflections. So ultimately, if you did a histogram of the reflected energy in the room after an impulsive sound, let's say you clapped your hands and you looked on a microphone and looking at how the pulses are coming over time, in a room that's done correctly, you would want the energy to fall off evenly, not have a clustering of it. You'd want it to fall off evenly. And if the room was 450 square feet, which is about 24, 25 feet long, 18 to 19 feet wide, you would want the decay time, the time it takes for that energy to go down 60 dB to be about 0.32 seconds. Okay, that's a kind of a good target. Now, in the rooms we're all working with, the decay time should be somewhere between 0.2 and 0.4 seconds, depending on whether it's a small room or a big room. And what's interesting is you put 20 of your best friends in a room and you try different amounts of acoustics. Most of them are going to agree to the point at which, wow, now it sounds really good. Don't believe me? There was a consortium of about 4 or 5 companies and countries about 35 years ago. They got together and did research on this to see, hey, is there a statistical relevance to how people like the reflection decay time in the room? And that group said there is. Most people like rooms if they're about this size, they like this decay time, and they came up with an equation that tells you either in the imperial side of things or in the metric side of things, what is your target. So if you have a room that's around 3,500 cubic feet, the target should be about 0.3 seconds. If it's 100 cubic meters, 0.3 seconds. Okay. Now, to get there, I find usually all you have to do is to cover the walls with about 15% of absorptive material, typically absorber panels made out of either dense rock wool, dense fiberglass, foams, things like that. That's all it takes. Doesn't take more than that. So the bigger the room, the longer the decay time, and just as important as that, you would want the decay time to be the same across frequencies.
That's the key right there. See, a lot of people tend to overtreat a room with fuzz. They put 1-inch fuzz all around the room and then they fabric wrap it. And then you created a low pass filter. You've got a really low decay time at above 10 kilohertz, but you also killed the high frequencies and the room sounds dead and dry. Right.
So this is not my opinion. If you could instantly go to the Library of Congress and look at all the books on room acoustics and what people like for decay times and how you build rooms with good acoustics, they would tell you first you want to have this decay time, and then tell you that that decay time needs to be as smooth across frequency as possible. This is this TM over here. So let's say we're talking about this 450 square foot room that should have a decay time of whatever I said, 0.32 seconds. You would want that at 1,000 hertz, at 4,000 hertz, at 10 kilohertz, at 63 hertz. And what that takes is treatments that are not just 1 inch thick. They need to be thicker. And At some point, they're so thick, they're taking up so much room. So then there's other tricks for how to deal with this, which we'll get into at another point. But now the good news is you can actually let the decay time rise up to 100% more. So that 0.32 could become 0.64 at 63 hertz without anybody going, boy, the sound really sucks in here. In fact, most people would say, I kind of like it better. It's a little warmer. And on the high frequency, you can let the decay time fall off to 50% of where it was. So 0.15 something or 0.16 and at 10 kilohertz. And most people won't notice the difference. So there's some tolerance, right? It can be twice as long at 63 hertz and it can be half as long at 10 kilohertz and you'll be fine.
Also, it matters on how many speakers you have in the room too. If you're just doing 2-channel, you want a little bit higher, RT60 decay time because you're not getting spatial cues from multiple speakers around the room. So that whether you're doing 2-channel or multi-channel makes a difference too. It
does. What I found generally is that the variances are not that big. It's not like you have to completely rethink your treatment system, whether you're doing 2-channel, but you're right. Usually for 2-channel, it's more enjoyable to have a little longer decay time, but please make it smoother frequency. So getting it right is the right amount of absorbers, the right amount of bass absorbers, and you can calculate that with these really complicated equations that are called the Sabine, the Eyring, or Arau-Puchadis equation. And I don't have time to get into this. One day, Gene, if we want, we could spend 2 hours going through calculations of that. Or you could just follow this handy rule of thumb, which is to cover about 15% of the walls with absorption. If you can, 15 to 20% with diffusion, and spread these things evenly around the room, you're going to get a much nicer decay time. And don't forget to also treat the ceiling. I've been in rooms sometimes where they do all the stuff on the walls and the ceiling is all flat and reflective. That's not so good. And make sure to include something to control the low frequency. So if you wanted to control all the way to 100 hertz with materials on the walls, they start to get really thick. And it's just not appropriate. But there's all these different bass absorbers you can put towards the edges of the room that have different methodologies in how they work. We'll talk about that on some future talk, I'm sure. So, all right. I am not going to show this again. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. So, final piece of this, because we're 3 minutes over time. Isn't that cool? So ultimately, the purpose of this whole talk is I'm going to calibrate the response of my room. I've got Dirac, I've got some of the other audio EQ methods, or I've actually bought a manual EQ and I've got a microphone, a test microphone like this. They don't cost that much money. I'm using Room EQ Wizard or some other analysis system. What do I do now? What you do now is to, one, understand the radiation power of your speaker. It's axial response, off-axis response, and its sound power. 1. 2, you need to measure the decay time of your room. It's easy to do. Put a speaker in there, press the measure on Room EQ Wizard, and look at the decay time. I'll show you that in a few minutes. Now you look at both of those things and you go, okay, now I know what my target curve is going to be. So let's go over that. So
the interesting thing about that, in my experience with the RT60 decay and REW, is you can measure the speaker in the room. It's pretty consistent above the bass frequencies around the room. So around your listening seats. Yeah, that's pretty consistent.
Yeah. You can move around. You can go to different speakers. You'll get slightly different results as the calculation gets kind of different bounces from the room. But overall, the curves look similar. So in doing the frequency response calibration, also known as EQ, you're going to measure the room. You're going to figure out this target curve. I prefer to have 4 microphones and what's called a multiplexer, which is you put the 4 microphones down on four stands, and you get this box that allows you to switch between the 4 mics. The output of that goes to your analyzer. Unfortunately, while there were several multiplexers on the market a while back, I don't know that anybody really makes one anymore. I think there's only one out there. Yeah. You can still buy some used ones, but it's just as a switcher.
Valadyne used to have one, believe it or not.
Who did?
Valadyne. They used to have one.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. They had a measurement multiplexer system for their subs.
Now, you can, with Room EQ Wizard, you can pay this extra little fee and you can use a 4-channel USB interface and have 4 USB mics, and it can do some of that for you too. You can just have one mic that you move around, make sure you mark the locations. So target curve. What sounds right? The target curve is ultimately what is a measurement of what sounds right when using omnidirectional mics, which sounds like weird. It's like, wait, I got a mic. I'm going to tune the room until it sounds good, and then I'm going to measure it. No, you're actually going to look at all these things. You're going to EQ to a start target curve, and you're going to listen. You go, you know what? I need a little more highs, a little less highs, and you're going to start with one speaker at a time and tune that, and that will probably be the target curve for your whole room, assuming your speakers have the same directivity. So ultimately, the target curve is a reflection of the natural sound power of the speaker. You can't change that. It is what it is. And it is what makes our ear brain be happy when it listens to the direct and the reflected sounds of this room. So let's look at this. There are many variables. Bottom line is there's a lot of things you got to think about. This is the typical standard that, can I mention Sean Olive, one of Floyd Toole's colleague disciples, spent a bunch of time going, what actually measures right for most speakers in most rooms? And he came up with a target curve that looks something like this, where there's a gentle downward slope, 5 dB gain below 150 hertz, about a 1 dB per octave fall off, and then around 6 or 7 kilohertz, the drop off gets a little bit larger depending on which version of this target curve you've seen. I usually start with this. Well, let's start with this and let's listen to it. And then you may decide, too much bass, too little bass, or the top end is a little shy. I'm going to turn the treble back up or not. But this is a great start. So that target curve was arrived at by the folks in Sean's team by looking at a lot of different speakers in a bunch of different rooms. And on average, this is what works for most speakers. Now, those speakers were generally speakers that don't have as wide of a sound power as the speaker, Gene, you have and the speakers we make. And so this nick down is a result of speakers that have more directivity at high frequency. They're hot spotting a bit. So anyway, now you take a good speaker like the one you have or the one we make, you put it in a room with good treatment in which the decay time is even with frequency, and you tune until you go, that sounds really good. And I'll tell you in a few seconds what I think sounds really good. One of the ways to make it to agree that it sounds really good is you have you and 20 of your best friends listening to their favorite music. You play a bunch of things and everybody agrees, that sounds great. I love it. This is a speaker with a really smooth sound power in a room with a really even decay time with frequency. And this is the target curve, almost flat all the way up with a little kink at 10 kilohertz. There's less slope. Still 5 dB gain below 150 hertz, because that has to do with how we hear things versus an omnidirectional mic measures them in a regular room. The breakpoint in this case is at 10K instead of 6K. Now, this is a measurement I did last week. And if I had more time, I would have shown you a measurement of what I just did this afternoon. Peter, if you're listening, hi. So this is a room with pretty smooth reflection decay time with frequency. There's a little bit of an attenuation here at about 800 hertz, may have been a measurement result, whatever. But basically, across the frequencies here, it's all right around what it is, 0.33 330 milliseconds. And in that room, this was the resulting target curve it took to make the left speaker sound good. Correlation. A speaker with wide dispersion, this happened to be a Rixos S from us, wide dispersion speaker with even sound power in a room with a flat target, a smooth decay time with frequency. You tune it starting with the standard Harman Research Group target curve, and you go, ooh, sounds a little dull. You turn up the top end, pull down the bottom end a little bit, and here's what you get that sounds good. Again,
this is without the subs. This is just the speaker, right?
In this case, this is without the subs. Subs, I actually have the curve also with the sub. I just happened to print out the wrong one here, but the sub goes up about 4 or 5 dB from there.
Right.
I'm just talking about what's happening over here. There's still a little bit of downward tilt, but you got to understand that the sound power, especially in the higher frequencies, will affect your target curve. So this is a speaker with smooth sound power in a room that has smooth reflection decay time across frequencies, and the target curve is predictable. So how does it sound? Well, remember, this is a room in which the direct sound was good. The reflected sound is smooth decay with frequency. Ultimately, the reflections still dominate. With a good sound power, you could end up with something predictable. So, starting with that target curve is a good start, and then you listen. So what I like to do in the listening is this. I don't trust my ears. I've only been listening for 45 years, critically. I started my career at Dolby 40 years ago, but I was doing a lot of music 5 years before that. I still don't trust my ears because one day I could be listening one way or the other. So instead, I use these little in-ear monitors that Etymotic makes, and I listen to music or pink noise in my ear, stick it in there, listen a little bit, go, yeah, that sounds good, and then listen to what's coming off the speakers after they've been equalized in a room with a good decay time. You've done all of the work you need to do, and you go, does that sound the same? Is the mid-range the same? Is the singer sound like he or she has the same projection, or do they sound a little recessed? Is the snare drum sounding the same? I think of snare as like a little burst of pink noise. Is the hi-hat sounding the same? Are the cymbals sounding the same? Just listen across all of that and make sure it sounds the same. And then I usually start with that with one speaker at a time, and then compare that the three speakers sound the same to each other as you play the sound across them, and then do some final tuning. At the end, you may have to reset the levels if you're changing the EQ significantly, but ultimately, if you know the sound power of the speaker, which you can get by looking at those spinorama curves from an increasing number of manufacturers that are revealing those, or actually from the 3 or 4 websites where individuals have gotten the speaker, measure them, and publish them for you. Very cool. If you know that, and then you have a measurement of the decay time of the room, which I went through that curve pretty quickly earlier, but you just put a speaker in there, put the microphone on the seating position, hit measure, Control M, and look at what's called RT60. And you'll see a curve. There's a bunch of different ones you can look at. We can do a whole session on that at some future point. So that's kind of what I wanted to say. Now, the speaker is up to you. You got to choose. You got to choose the right speaker. Choose wisely, like they said in that movie. And then you got to choose the right treatments. The right absorbers, the right diffusers. I'll maybe conclude really quickly with a little shameless propaganda for some of the things we sell in the Sonatus brand, if I may, Gene, really quickly.
There's actually a question on that. It says, hey, Anthony, wondering if you have an ETA on some of your out-of-stock Sonatus products.
Probably 4 to 5 weeks at this point, and sorry about that. All of the business with the transports and the tariffs has made that all a little complicated. That's all eased out, so things are finishing their production. They're going to be put in a container and come back. So Sonatus, hey, this is some Sonatus gear at somebody's room that I know.
Yes, you were just here.
I was just there. So this is Gene's space. This is his phenomenal big speakers. He's got a big thumbs up. And so he put a bunch of absorbers and diffusers in there. Not so many, just the right amount. Let's switch to this really quickly. I really appreciate that you guys are hanging a long time here. I promise this won't hurt. So on absorbers, Gene mentioned you don't want to just put a little thin panel on the wall. Why? Because 1-inch absorbers that are available from a lot of different people, whether they're fiberglass, Rockwell, or whatever, they really only absorb down to 1.5 kilohertz, and then they stop doing anything. So the walls are essentially still reflectors at 500 hertz. A 2-inch panel absorbs down to 500 hertz or 500-600 hertz, then dies out. A 4-inch panel absorbs down to 250. If you care about your sound quality, you'll get 4-inch thick panels. of
And put a gap,
absorbers.
and if you put a 2-inch gap behind that, it lowers that effectiveness down another
Yeah.
half octave, right?
So a really good way to do a 1.5-inch gap is take a 2x4 or 2x2, put that on the wall behind the panels, screw the panels or mount the panels on that. You get a 1.5-inch gap. It's good for down about 150 hertz. That's really good. That's the right way to do it. So this is a thing I often see people get, which is this corrugated foam, 1 or 2 inches. This stuff don't work so good. It doesn't work very well because it looks, it looks fancy, but really the average absorption is, into the middle of the wedge. You only, out of a 2-inch foam sheet, you really only get inch and a half worth of absorption. It's cheap and it works cheap. Don't do it. This is what Gene was saying, that if you float a panel away from the wall by 1 inch or 2 inch or 3 inches, you get better absorption down to a lower frequency. So that's a worthwhile thing to do. Again, on absorbers, don't overabsorb. 15 to 20% maximum, because dead rooms just sound bad. You want to get to that target reflection decay time. I've done about 1,200 rooms now since in the last 30 to 40 years, and that's been the target, and it always sounds great with that. So panels are available from different manufacturers and all kinds of different colors and shapes and forms, beveled edge, round edge, whatever. In the Sonatus line, we have a series of absorbers. There's the thing called the Legato 8, which is this curved panel made out of dense polyester foam with a velvet coating on it that's really nice. And it's available in 8 centimeters thick, which is 3 inches, or 12 centimeter thick, which is 5 inches. The 5-inch one costs more and works better in proper acoustic language. And there's the range. This number is not random. This was actually measured in a chamber in Europe. It does work to a lower frequency than you would think a resistive panel does through friction, because the top coating is slightly tympanic. That's a trick to get absorbers to work to lower frequencies, is have something that makes them a little bit of a drum head that's porous in the mids and highs, and at low frequency has a bit of drum head character. So you can get these in various colors. We also have this wacky, cool looking thing called a Wavex, that same kind of foam. It's sculptured in a different way. It's about 4 inches thick. It's available in black or white, and on a wall it can look like this. Essentially the same performance as a Legato 12, but a different look. You choose. So going to skip through these things. We have some flat panels called the canvas absorbers that come in different colors, black or white. And then we have these interesting things, and I promise to quit after this. So we've got these things called a decozorber, which are a mid-frequency absorber. They're essentially the same material as what's on our other absorbers, but they're covered with a wood plate that's sculptured either with this shape or that shape or this shape. So it does let some sound through at the low, mids, and the bass. The top layer is tympanic, so it absorbs bass better than a regular frictional absorber, and you include those into your acoustic treatment package, and those things take care of the reflection energy below 300 or 400 hertz. And that's a cool way to treat your mid bass.
It looks like a board cube.
Yeah. And then finally, you do want to use low frequency absorbers, sometimes known as bass traps. Bunch of different things available from a bunch of different people. And we have these things called a deco trap, which is a thick layer of this dense polyester foam with a wood plate that's slotted at the front. Again, there's a bunch of different colors, bunch of different shapes.
I wish you had a way to join them together when you stack.
Yes. There are some trick ways to do that. We can talk about that, but yeah, you're right that they don't always completely overlap straight. There is a way to do that by actually inserting a very thin metal plate right behind the fascia of it. Anyway, these things are good for down to 60 hertz. I'm not going to pretend that they're dealing with 30 hertz. That would be a lie. However, most rooms in the sizes we're working in, you don't really have to worry about decay time or standing waves, which is really what these things address. below 40 hertz. They usually have their core bass resonance issues are from 40 hertz to about 100 hertz. So as long as you can get down close to that, you're dealing with that. So enough of that for now. We'll talk about scattering and diffusion in some future thing.
Yeah, the goal is we're going to
cover
do
here. I guess if you guys wanted to get a hold,
you got some delay
go
going
ahead.
on or something. Yeah, I think there's some delay between us. Anyways, we're planning on doing these live stream events maybe every 2 weeks. So we'll just build upon this topic and go further in the next one.
Right. So I've just put up the websites. If you guys want to reach out to us and look at our websites, I just put them up on the screen. But the reason we started today with this business of the target curve is it's actually the global look at the whole issue, which is good sound is not just achieved by having acoustical treatments. Good sound is achieved by having a room in which you've put speakers that have a decent sound power that radiate in the room really nicely. Then as they're bouncing, or as they're like all the ping pong balls, if you want to think of them, they came off the speaker, are bouncing around the room's returning them all about at the same energy, whether it's a big ball or a medium ball or a small ball, low, mid, and high frequency. And then you can equalize the room and get to places where it sounds really good. I think some of you may have had the experience of, I tried equalizing and it just didn't sound good. That may just be because you had speakers with a poor sound power and an acoustic treatment system that wasn't even with frequency. And your analyzer goes, I don't know what to make of this. So yeah, I'll twist it to this. And in the end, it's not what you wanted to hear.
Yep. Well, we'll definitely cover those topics in more detail in the next series of live streams. This is a good primer, Anthony, to get this going again. Appreciate it. Guys, if you like this video, please hit the thumb up, hit subscribe. Don't forget about our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. We appreciate your support. You get direct access to me if you want to suggest video topics. I'll put the links to Grimani stuff in the video description. So if you want to check out Sonatus, you want to check out his speakers, all that stuff will be there. So please reach out to Anthony. And I think you do like design services too, right?
Right. So the scope of the things we do under this roof is design a room for somebody. It may be just on paper. It may just be an architectural drawing and you go, what do I do with this? It's like, well, you do this, you do that, you do that. We produce a plan set that the builder, the integrator, the electrician, the plumber, everybody follows. The ventilation contractor. The plumber? Why the plumber? Well, so that they don't run pipes through the ceiling of your room where you hear the toilet getting flushed upstairs. Plumber's got to do that.
Yeah, you'd be surprised.
So that's one thing we do. We have these lines of acoustical treatments that are, I think of them as high value. They're not cheap. They're not expensive. They're just, you get a lot of value for your money, and they're kind of packaged so that so you look through the website and it goes, if you have a room that's 450 square feet, this is a package you need. So many of these absorbers, so many of these diffusers, so many of these bass traps. And then we also make speakers. These are actually 3 different groups within the building. So we make this line of kind of very modern speakers that are driven with active DSP amplifiers. They have a waveguide in them. They have a really high dynamics for the sound, the size of the speaker, and they're the good source device to put a great acoustic wave into the room.
Gotcha. All right, guys. Well, that is a wrap. Again, Anthony, appreciate you coming on our live stream, and you will be back.
I'll be back.
All right. All right, guys. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.